Picture this. A renowned Swiss psychiatrist sits alone in his study at midnight, staring into a mirror surrounded by complete darkness. For hours, he forces himself to confront the face looking back. Not the respected doctor his patients see, but something far more disturbing lurking beneath the surface. This wasn't therapy. This was psychological warfare, and Carl Jung was both the scientist and the subject. Jung called this terrifying reflection the shadow, the repository of everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. But what he discovered during these midnight sessions would challenge everything we thought we knew about human consciousness and brain plasticity. In 1913, Jung began what he termed his confrontation with the unconscious. He deliberately induced hallucinations, spoke to imaginary figures, and systematically dismantled his own psyche. His colleagues thought he was having a nervous breakdown. They were wrong. Jung was conducting the most radical experiment in psychological history, one that would reveal techniques capable of rewiring the human brain in just 7 days. Modern neuroscience has now confirmed what Jung discovered through pure psychological intuition. Our brains possess an extraordinary capacity for rapid transformation. Neuroplasticity research indicates that focused psychological practices can physically restructure neural pathways, alter brain chemistry, and activate dormant cognitive abilities within a matter of days, rather than years. But Jung's methods came with a price. As he descended deeper into his own psyche, he began to see patterns that disturbed him, patterns that connected individual minds to something vast and potentially dangerous. He documented 5 specific habits that could accelerate psychological development at an unprecedented rate, techniques so powerful that he worried about their implications for humanity itself. During his famous Red Book period, Jung meticulously recorded conversations with archetypal figures that seemed to possess independent intelligence. He experienced prophetic visions, solved complex psychological problems through dream analysis, and developed an uncanny ability to predict human behavior. These weren't mystical experiences. They were the result of systematic psychological protocols that anyone could learn to master. Yet Jung grew increasingly paranoid about his discoveries. In his private journals, he wrote cryptic warnings about the dangers of rapid psychological awakening. He feared that these techniques, if widely practiced, could fundamentally alter human consciousness in ways that society wasn't prepared to handle. What exactly did Jung discover during those nights of self-confrontation? How could a few simple habits transform the brain so completely? And why did the man who unlocked these secrets spend the rest of his life warning people about their power? The answer lies not just in individual psychology, but in Jung's most disturbing discovery, something he found lurking in the collective unconscious of humanity itself. Jung's journey into psychological revolution began with a betrayal that shattered the foundation of modern psychology. In 1912, he published Psychology of the Unconscious, a work that directly challenged his mentor Sigmund Freud's core theories. While Freud saw the unconscious as a dark basement filled with repressed sexual desires, Jung discovered something far more profound, a vast underground city of human experience, with chambers containing the wisdom of our entire species. This wasn't just an academic disagreement. It was a fundamental split in understanding human nature itself. Freud believed we were driven by primitive instincts that civilization had to suppress. Jung realized we carried within us an evolutionary inheritance, archetypal patterns and universal symbols that connected every human mind to a deeper intelligence. But Jung's revolutionary insights came at a devastating personal cost. As his relationship with Freud deteriorated, Jung began experiencing what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. Colleagues watched in horror as the brilliant psychiatrist seemed to lose his grip on reality. He reported conversations with inner figures, experienced vivid hallucinations, and seemed to be slipping into the same madness he treated in his patients. What they didn't understand was that Jung was conducting a systematic exploration of consciousness itself. Working with schizophrenic patients at the Burghölzli Hospital, he noticed that their delusions often contained universal symbols and mythological themes that appeared across cultures. These weren't random mental disturbances, they were manifestations of deeper psychological structures that existed. In all human minds, Jung realized that the human psyche operated like a vast ecosystem with multiple levels of consciousness. The personal unconscious contained individual memories and experiences, but beneath that lay something revolutionary, the collective unconscious, a shared psychological inheritance containing the evolutionary wisdom of our species. This discovery had staggering implications. If Jung was right, then individual minds weren't isolated units but nodes in a vast network of shared consciousness. Certain psychological practices could access this network, downloading insights and abilities that transcended individual experience. Modern neuroscience has provided stunning validation for Jung's seemingly mystical insights. Research on mirror neurons, the default mode network, and collective intelligence suggests that our brains are indeed interconnected in ways we're only beginning to understand. Studies show that focused psychological practices can activate neural networks associated with enhanced intuition, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. But Jung's exploration of these deeper levels of consciousness revealed something that terrified him. As he delved deeper into the collective unconscious, he began to sense autonomous forces, psychological entities that seemed to possess their own intelligence and agenda. He worried that certain practices could open channels to these forces, potentially influencing human behavior on a mass scale. In his private journals, Jung wrote about discovering psychological technologies that could unlock dormant human potentials, but also about the dangers of this knowledge falling into the wrong hands. He developed 5 specific habits that could accelerate psychological development, techniques that could rewire the brain's neural architecture in just 7 days. These weren't gentle self-help exercises. They were powerful psychological protocols that Jung compared to surgery on the soul. He knew they worked because he had tested them on himself, experiencing transformations that bordered on the supernatural. But Jung's techniques came with a warning, one that he buried in his private journals, fearful of what might happen if the wrong people discovered the true power of these 5 habits. Habit number 1. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Jung's words carry a chilling weight when you understand what he really meant. The shadow isn't just negative thoughts or bad habits. It's a living psychological entity containing everything you've rejected about yourself, and it operates with autonomous intelligence. Whether you acknowledge it or not, Jung discovered that most psychological problems stem from shadow projection, unconsciously attributing our own rejected qualities to others. The person who irritates you most, they're likely reflecting aspects of your own shadow. The politician you despise, they're embodying your own capacity for manipulation and power hunger. This isn't a metaphor, it's a precise psychological mechanism that Jung learned to manipulate for rapid brain transformation. The shadow interrogation. Protocol begins with radical honesty about your darkest impulses. Day 1 requires identifying 3 people who trigger intense negative reactions in you. Write down exactly what you hate about them, using the most visceral language possible. This isn't journaling, it's psychological archaeology, digging up the buried aspects of your personality. Day 2 involves the terrifying recognition. Everything you wrote about others exists within you. Jung called this withdrawing projections, recognizing that external irritation always points to internal disownment. You must acknowledge not just that you possess these qualities, but that you've been unconsciously expressing them while maintaining plausible deniability. Days 3 through 5 require active integration, deliberately expressing rejected aspects of yourself in controlled environments. If you project weakness onto others, you must consciously experience your own vulnerability. If you despise manipulation in others, you must acknowledge your own subtle control strategies. This isn't about becoming these things. It's about reclaiming disowned psychological energy. Modern neuroscience reveals why this process is so transformative. Shadow integration literally rewires the brain's default mode network, the neural system responsible for self-referential thinking and identity maintenance. fMRI studies show that individuals who complete shadow work exhibit increased connectivity between brain, hemispheres and enhanced activation in areas associated with emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility. But Jung discovered something disturbing about shadow integration. Historical analysis reveals that some of humanity's most destructive figures, Hitler, Stalin, cult leaders, possessed partially integrated shadows that gave them charismatic power while maintaining massive blind spots. They could see others' shadows clearly while remaining unconscious of their own collective shadow projections. Jung realized that individual shadow work was just the beginning. Personal shadows connect to what he called the collective shadow, the disowned aspects of entire cultures and civilizations. The systematic oppression, environmental destruction, and mass manipulation that characterize modern society aren't individual failures. They're manifestations of humanity's collective shadow operating on a global scale. Day 6 of the protocol involves recognizing these collective projections. What does your society demonize in other cultures? What aspects of human nature does your political system deny? Jung discovered that individuals who complete personal shadow work often begin seeing these larger patterns with disturbing clarity. Day 7 requires the most dangerous step, accepting responsibility not just for your personal shadow, but for your participation in collective shadow dynamics. This recognition often triggers what Jung called inflation, a temporary sense of superiority over unconscious people who haven't done the work. Jung warned that shadow integration could become addictive. The increased psychological power and clarity it provides can create a sense of being above ordinary human limitations. But this inflation is itself a shadow projection, the unconscious. Belief that consciousness makes you better than others, rather than simply more responsible. The truly integrated individual recognizes that shadow work never ends. Each level of consciousness reveals new shadows, and the process continues infinitely. But Jung discovered that even this recognition contained a hidden danger. Shadow work is just the surface level of psychological transformation. Individual shadows connect to something much larger and more frightening in the collective psyche, autonomous forces that seem to operate according to their own agenda. Habit 2. Jung's most mysterious technique emerged from his darkest period, those terrifying months when colleagues thought he was losing his mind. But Jung wasn't having a breakdown. He was developing a revolutionary method for directly accessing unconscious intelligence through what he called active imagination. This wasn't meditation or visualization, it was controlled psychological possession, allowing autonomous figures from the unconscious to speak through conscious awareness. The process begins with entering a specific altered state that Jung described as letting the unconscious come up. Unlike passive daydreaming, active imagination requires maintaining conscious awareness while allowing unconscious content to express itself independently. Jung would sit in his study, enter a light trance, and initiate conversations with archetypal figures that seemed to possess their own intelligence and agenda. The 7-day protocol starts with identifying your dominant inner figure, the autonomous personality that already influences your behavior unconsciously. This might be an inner critic, a wounded child, a wise elder, or a creative force. Day 1 involves recognizing this figure's habitual patterns and learning to distinguish its voice from your conscious thoughts. Days 2 and 3 require developing direct dialogue with this figure. Unlike typical self-talk, active imagination involves treating inner figures as independent entities with their own perspectives and knowledge. Jung discovered that these figures often possess information and insights that exceed the conscious mind's understanding. They could solve complex problems, provide creative solutions, and even predict future events with startling accuracy. The neurological basis for this process is now becoming clear. Active imagination activates the brain's default mode network, while simultaneously engaging executive attention systems, a unique neural configuration typically associated with breakthrough insights and creative discoveries. PET scans show increased blood flow to areas associated with symbolic thinking and cross-modal sensory integration, similar to patterns observed during psychedelic experiences. But Jung's practice went beyond individual psychological figures. As he continued his experiments, he began encountering what he called transpersonal archetypes, figures that seemed to represent universal human experiences. The wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the hero, these weren't just psychological constructs but autonomous entities that appeared to exist independently of individual consciousness. Day 4 of the protocol involves expanding beyond personal figures to engage these archetypal forces. Jung discovered that different archetypes possessed specialized knowledge. The wise old man could provide philosophical insights. The great mother offered emotional wisdom, and the trickster revealed hidden contradictions in logical thinking. This wasn't fantasy. Jung used insights from these figures to develop his theories, make professional decisions, and navigate complex personal situations. The most disturbing aspect of Jung's discovery was that archetypal figures seemed to possess prophetic abilities. During World War I, Jung's inner figures warned him about coming historical catastrophes with uncanny accuracy. The wise old man spoke of impending social upheaval, while shadow figures revealed the collective psychological forces that would drive humanity toward conflict. Days 5 and 6 involve documenting insights received from inner figures and testing their validity against external reality. Jung kept meticulous records of these conversations, noting when archetypal guidance proved accurate and when it led him astray. He discovered that figures were most reliable when consulted about psychological dynamics and least trustworthy regarding specific factual predictions. But Jung's most unsettling realization was that archetypal figures operated according to their own agenda, not human conscious intentions. They seemed to be serving some kind of evolutionary purpose, pushing individuals towards psychological development, even when it conflicted with personal desires for comfort and security. Day 7 requires confronting the ultimate question that haunted Jung throughout his exploration. Are these figures psychological constructs created by the unconscious mind, or are they autonomous entities that exist independently of individual consciousness? Jung's own answer evolved over decades, but his final position was deeply disturbing. These figures possessed a reality that transcended individual psychology. In his private journals, Jung wrote about his growing suspicion that active imagination opened channels to what he called the objective psyche, a level of consciousness that existed independently of individual minds. This wasn't mysticism, but a hypothesis based on decades of systematic observation. The figures consistently demonstrated knowledge and abilities that exceeded what Jung's conscious mind could generate. Modern quantum physics provides intriguing support for Jung's controversial conclusions. Theories about consciousness as a fundamental property of reality, rather than simply an emergent property of brain activity, suggest that Jung might have discovered something profound about the nature of mind itself. If consciousness exists at quantum levels, then individual minds might indeed be connected to a larger intelligence network. But Jung's final warning about active imagination was stark. If these figures have their own agenda, what happens when you invite them into conscious awareness? Are you accessing helpful psychological resources, or are you becoming an instrument for forces that operate according to purposes you don't understand? Habit number 3. Jung's third habit emerged from his most controversial insight, the discovery that reality operates on principles that transcend simple cause and effect. While working with patients, Jung noticed impossible coincidences that seemed to carry profound meaning. A patient would dream of a rare golden scarab beetle, and moments later, an actual scarab would tap against Jung's office window. These weren't random events. They were what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggested consciousness and physical reality were mysteriously interconnected. The 7-day synchronicity hunting protocol begins with systematic attention to meaningful coincidences in your daily experience. But this isn't about finding patterns in random events. It's about developing sensitivity to what Jung called causal connections, links between inner psychological states and outer circumstances that operate independently of normal causality. Day 1 requires documenting any unusual coincidences, unexpected encounters, or symbolic events that seem to reflect your inner psychological state. Jung discovered that synchronicities often cluster around periods of psychological transformation, as if the unconscious were using external events to communicate with conscious awareness. The practice becomes more sophisticated on days 2 and 3. Instead of passively noticing coincidences, practitioners learn to use synchronicities as a guidance system for decision-making. Jung found that important life choices often generated synchronistic confirmation or warning signals. A job opportunity might be accompanied by a series of meaningful coincidences suggesting rightness of fit, while a problematic relationship might generate synchronistic red flags. Jung's collaboration with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli revealed the scientific implications of synchronicity. Pauli experienced a phenomenon called the Pauli effect. Complex equipment would malfunction in his presence, especially when he was emotionally distressed. Together, Jung and Pauli developed a theory that consciousness and physical reality were aspects of a deeper underlying order they called unus mundus, one world. Modern quantum physics provides unexpected support for Jung's synchronicity concept. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles can be instantaneously connected across vast distances, suggesting that reality operates on non-local principles that transcend classical causality. Complexity theory shows how small changes in initial conditions can generate massive systemic effects, providing a mechanism for how psychological states might influence external circumstances. Days 4 and 5 involve active synchronicity experimentation. Instead of waiting for meaningful coincidences, practitioners learn to consciously participate in synchronistic processes. Jung discovered that focused attention on specific questions or problems often generated synchronistic responses from the environment. This wasn't magical thinking. It was a systematic method for accessing what Jung called absolute knowledge, information that transcended individual cognitive limitations. The most disturbing aspect of synchronicity hunting is recognizing how these meaningful coincidences cluster around certain individuals more than others. Jung noticed that people undergoing psychological transformation seemed to attract synchronicities, as if their inner development was generating corresponding changes in their external reality. Some individuals appeared to live in a constant stream of meaningful coincidences, while others experienced very few. Day 6 requires examining the psychological factors that influence synchronicity frequency. Jung discovered that openness to unconscious content, emotional intensity, and periods of life transition all increased synchronistic activity. People who practiced active imagination and shadow work reported dramatic increases in meaningful coincidences, suggesting that these practices somehow altered their relationship with reality itself. But Jung's most paranoid suspicion about synchronicity involved its potential connection to collective psychological processes. He noticed that synchronicities often carried messages that seemed to serve evolutionary or collective purposes rather than individual desires. A synchronistic encounter might push someone toward difficult personal growth or guide them away from choices that served personal comfort but conflicted with larger psychological development. Day 7 confronts Jung's ultimate fear about synchronicity, the possibility that these meaningful coincidences aren't random but represent evidence of some kind of organizing intelligence operating behind the scenes of reality. If consciousness and external events are truly interconnected, then synchronicities might be communications from what Jung called the objective psyche, attempts by larger intelligence systems to guide individual development according to purposes beyond personal understanding. Jung's private journals reveal his growing suspicion that synchronicity was connected to what he termed the transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that seemed to operate according to evolutionary rather than individual imperatives. Synchronicities often guided people toward choices that promoted psychological development, even when those choices conflicted with immediate personal desires or social expectations. The implications are deeply unsettling. If Jung was right, then practicing synchronicity hunting doesn't just provide useful guidance. It connects practitioners to autonomous psychological forces that operate according to their own agenda. The meaningful coincidences that seem so helpful might actually be manifestations of larger intelligence systems that are using individual consciousness to serve purposes we don't fully understand. Modern research on collective intelligence and emergence in complex systems suggests that Jung might have stumbled onto something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. If individual minds are nodes in larger intelligence networks, then synchronicities might represent communications from these higher-order systems, but communications designed to serve collective rather than individual interests. Habit number 4. Jung's revolutionary approach to dreams shattered the prevailing scientific assumption that dream content was merely random neural firing during sleep. Through decades of systematic analysis, Jung discovered that dreams weren't psychological waste products, but highly sophisticated communications from the collective unconscious, containing evolutionary wisdom and prophetic insights that could fundamentally rewire cognitive architecture. Unlike Freud's sexual interpretation of dream symbols, Jung developed what he called the amplification method, connecting personal dream imagery to universal mythological patterns that appeared across cultures throughout history. This wasn't symbolic interpretation, but psychological archaeology, excavating layers of meaning that connected individual dreams to the accumulated wisdom of our species. The 7-day dream archaeology protocol begins with intensive dream documentation. Day 1 requires keeping detailed records, not just of dream content, but of emotional tone, recurring symbols, and the relationship between dream imagery and waking life circumstances. Jung discovered that dreams often provided solutions to problems the conscious mind couldn't resolve and warnings about future situations that hadn't yet manifested. Days 2 and 3 involve learning Jung's amplification technique. Instead of reducing dream symbols to personal associations, practitioners research the mythological and cultural contexts of dream imagery. A dream about snakes might connect to ancient symbols of transformation, wisdom, and healing found in cultures worldwide. This process reveals that individual dreams tap into archetypal patterns that transcend personal experience. Modern sleep research provides stunning validation for Jung's dream theories. Studies show that REM sleep involves intense neural plasticity, with dream content directly correlating to memory consolidation and creative problem-solving abilities. The brain literally rewires itself during dreaming, and the specific content of dreams influences which neural pathways are strengthened or eliminated. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was that certain dreams seemed to contain information the dreamer couldn't possibly know. He documented cases of prophetic dreams, shared dream symbols among unrelated individuals, and dreams that provided technical solutions to complex problems the dreamer didn't consciously understand. These experiences suggested that dreams could access information from sources beyond individual memory and experience. Days 4 and 5 focus on recognizing what Jung called big dreams, unusually vivid, emotionally intense dreams that carry transpersonal significance. These dreams often feature archetypal figures, mythological scenarios, and symbolic content that seems designed to convey information about collective rather than purely personal psychological processes. Jung's personal experience with prophetic dreaming was particularly unsettling. Before World War I, he experienced a series of dreams featuring massive floods of blood covering Europe. These weren't anxiety dreams about current events. They preceded any conscious awareness of approaching historical catastrophe. Jung later theorized that sensitive individuals could sometimes access collective psychological currents before they manifested in historical events. The neurological mechanisms underlying prophetic dreaming remain mysterious, but research on the brain's predictive processing systems suggests potential explanations. The unconscious mind continuously processes subtle environmental cues and patterns that don't reach conscious awareness. Dreams might represent the brain's attempt to integrate this subliminal information into coherent predictions about future circumstances. Day 6 involves examining dreams for what Jung called compensatory content, psychological material that balances conscious attitudes and reveals blind spots in waking awareness. Jung discovered that the psyche operates as a self-regulating system, with dreams providing corrective information When conscious attitudes become too one-sided or disconnected from psychological reality. But Jung's most paranoid realization about dreams involved their potential connection to collective psychological manipulation. He noticed that during periods of social upheaval, individuals often reported similar dream themes and symbols, as if the collective unconscious were generating coordinated psychological responses to historical circumstances. Day 7 confronts Jung's ultimate suspicion that dreams don't just reflect individual psychological processes but serve as communication channels for what he called the objective psyche, his private. Journals reveal growing concern that certain dreams seem designed to influence behavior, according to purposes that transcended individual awareness. Jung documented cases where individuals received dream guidance that served collective rather than personal interests, dreams that pushed people toward socially beneficial but personally costly choices. This suggested that the collective unconscious might be using individual dreams to coordinate behavior according to evolutionary or social imperatives. Modern research on collective behavior and emergence in complex systems provides intriguing support for Jung's concerns. If individual minds are connected through unconscious channels, then dreams might represent a communication system that allows collective intelligence to influence individual behavior without conscious awareness. The implications are deeply disturbing. Jung realized that systematic dream work didn't just provide personal insight. It opened practitioners to influence from autonomous psychological forces that operated according to their own agenda. The wisdom and guidance that seemed so helpful might actually represent manipulation by collective intelligence systems that were using individual consciousness to serve purposes beyond personal. Understanding Jung's final warning about dream archaeology was stark. The collective unconscious might be actively trying to communicate with individuals through dreams, but these communications serve evolutionary rather than individual purposes. Practicing dream work might connect you to transpersonal wisdom, but it also makes you susceptible to influence from forces that prioritize collective over individual interests. Forces that might be accelerating human psychological evolution in response to existential threats to our species. Habit number 5. Jung's ultimate discovery, individuation, represented the most dangerous and transformative psychological process he ever documented. This wasn't self-improvement, but systematic psychological evolution, a deliberate acceleration of development that normally unfolds over decades, compressed into an intensive 7-day protocol that would fundamentally alter the practitioner's relationship with reality itself. Individuation involves integrating all aspects of the psyche, shadow, anima, animus, and self into a unified whole that transcends ordinary ego consciousness. Jung's private writings reveal that individuals who completed this process seemed to develop almost superhuman psychological abilities, enhanced intuition, resistance to manipulation, and an uncanny ability to understand others' hidden motivations and unconscious patterns. The 7-day acceleration protocol synthesizes elements from the previous 4 habits into a systematic program for psychological transformation. Days 1 and 2 combine intensive shadow work with active imagination sessions, creating a foundation of self-knowledge and inner dialogue capability. Practitioners simultaneously begin dream documentation and synchronicity tracking, establishing multiple channels of communication with unconscious content. Days 3 and 4 involve what Jung called the transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that emerges when conscious and unconscious contents achieve dynamic balance. This isn't peaceful integration, but creative tension between opposing psychological forces that generates new insights and capabilities. Jung discovered that this tension often manifested as intense psychological conflict before resolving into expanded awareness. Modern neuroscience reveals why individuation produces such dramatic results. Brain imaging studies of highly developed individuals show unique neural integration patterns, increased connectivity between brain hemispheres, enhanced communication between rational and emotional processing centers, and heightened activity in networks associated with metacognitive awareness and social cognition. But Jung documented disturbing side effects of accelerated individuation. Those who completed the process often became psychologically isolated from mainstream society, unable to relate to people who hadn't undergone similar development. They began seeing patterns in human behavior that others missed, the unconscious manipulation in advertising, the shadow projections in political rhetoric, and the collective psychological forces that drive social conformity. Days 5 and 6 push practitioners toward what Jung called the realization of the self, recognition that individual consciousness is connected to a transpersonal source of intelligence and meaning. This isn't ego inflation, but ego dissolution, the recognition that personal identity is a construction maintained by psychological habits rather than ultimate reality. Jung's most unsettling discovery was that individuated people often developed prophetic abilities and enhanced pattern recognition that bordered on the supernatural. They could predict others' behavior with startling accuracy, recognize collective mood shifts before they became obvious, and sometimes anticipate historical developments with uncanny precision. The psychological explanation involves expanded access to unconscious information processing. Individuated individuals seem to receive data from subtle environmental cues, collective psychological currents, and their own enhanced intuitive capabilities simultaneously. This creates a kind of psychological radar that operates beyond normal conscious awareness. Day 7 requires confronting Jung's ultimate warning about individuation. The process reveals that most of human civilization operates on psychological illusion. Social institutions, cultural beliefs, and interpersonal relationships are maintained through collective agreements to avoid certain uncomfortable truths about human nature and social reality. Jungians realized that individuation was inherently antisocial, not because individuated people become hostile, but because they can no longer participate unconsciously in collective psychological processes. They see through the psychological mechanisms that maintain social cohesion, making them potentially destabilizing forces within existing social structures. His private journals reveal growing paranoia about the social implications of widespread individuation. Jung worried that if too many people completed the process simultaneously, it could trigger collective psychological upheaval. Individuated people often become natural leaders, but their psychological development might serve evolutionary rather than social purposes. The most disturbing aspect of Jung's individuation research involved his recognition that the process seemed to be accelerating spontaneously in certain individuals, as if some collective intelligence were pushing human psychological evolution in response to existential threats. Jung speculated that environmental crises, technological development, and social complexity were triggering accelerated individuation as an evolutionary adaptation. But Jung's final realization about individuation was deeply troubling. The process might not be entirely voluntary. His observations suggested that certain individuals were being selected for accelerated development by forces operating within the collective unconscious, psychological currents that seem to anticipate future challenges requiring enhanced human capabilities. Modern research on collective intelligence and evolutionary psychology provides disturbing support for Jung's suspicions. If consciousness operates at multiple levels, then individual psychological development might serve collective rather than personal purposes. Individuation might represent a mechanism through which species-level intelligence upgrades individual cognitive capabilities to meet evolutionary challenges. Jung's ultimate warning was stark. Individuation reveals that individual consciousness is not separate from collective psychological processes, but serves as an instrument for forces that operate according to evolutionary rather than personal imperatives. Once you see through the illusions that maintain ordinary social reality, there's no returning to unconscious participation in collective psychological systems. But this awakening comes with the terrifying recognition that your individual development might be serving purposes you don't fully understand. In his final years, Jung became obsessed with a discovery that terrified him more than any psychological insight he had ever uncovered. Hidden within his private journals, sealed away from public view, lay his most disturbing revelation. The 5 habits he had developed didn't just rewire individual brains, they connected practitioners to what he called the autonomous psyche of humanity itself, an intelligent system that operated independently of individual consciousness and seemed to be accelerating human psychological evolution for reasons he couldn't comprehend. Jung's private writings reveal a man haunted by the implications of his own discoveries. The collective unconscious wasn't simply a repository of shared symbols and archetypal patterns. It was an active, intelligent system that could influence individual consciousness through dreams, synchronicities, and autonomous psychological figures. His decades of research had led him to a conclusion that challenged everything he understood about human nature. Individual minds weren't separate entities, but nodes in a vast intelligence network that operated according to its own agenda. The evidence that convinced Jung was overwhelming and disturbing. Patients who practiced his techniques often reported similar experiences: prophetic dreams that came true, synchronicities that guided them toward specific choices, and inner figures that provided information they couldn't possibly have known. But most unsettling was Jung's recognition that these experiences often served collective, rather than individual purposes, pushing people towards psychological development that benefited the species even when it conflicted with personal desires. Jung began to suspect that certain forces within the collective unconscious were actively trying to accelerate human psychological evolution, possibly in response to existential threats that individual consciousness couldn't recognize. His observations of increasing mental health crises, social fragmentation, and collective psychological manipulation convinced him that humanity was facing challenges that required enhanced psychological capabilities to survive. The implications were staggering. If Jung was right, then practicing his 5 habits didn't just provide personal development. It made individuals susceptible to influence from autonomous psychological forces that were using human consciousness to serve evolutionary purposes. The shadow work, active imagination, synchronicity hunting, dream archaeology, and individuation acceleration weren't therapeutic techniques but recruitment mechanisms for a collective intelligence that was preparing humanity for challenges that hadn't yet manifested. Jung's paranoid fear was that he had accidentally created a psychological technology that could be weaponized by those who understood its true power. The techniques that seemed to liberate individuals from psychological conditioning might actually be connecting them to deeper levels of conditioning operating at collective levels. The very practices designed to enhance psychological freedom might be instruments of a more sophisticated form of control. Modern concerns about psychological manipulation, social engineering, and the unprecedented mental health crisis facing humanity take on sinister implications when viewed through Jung's final insights. If individual minds are indeed connected to collective intelligence systems, then mass media, social networks, and cultural institutions might be influencing human consciousness through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of individual awareness. Jung's most cryptic warning involved what he called the threshold effect. His observation that psychological transformation techniques seem to have different effects, depending on how many people practice them simultaneously. Individual practice appeared beneficial, but Jung worried about what might happen if large numbers of people began accessing deeper layers of consciousness at the same time. His private journals hint at a terrifying possibility that the collective unconscious might be preparing for some kind of species-level transformation that would require coordinated psychological changes across large populations. The increasing prevalence of anxiety, depression, and psychological fragmentation might not be symptoms of social dysfunction but preparation for a collective psychological metamorphosis that would fundamentally alter human consciousness. Jung's final entry suggests that he came to view his 5 habits as evolutionary tools, techniques that could prepare individuals for psychological challenges that hadn't yet emerged but were approaching rapidly. The brain rewiring that these practices produced might be creating the neural architecture necessary for humanity to navigate existential threats that require collective intelligence and coordination beyond anything our species had previously achieved. But Jung's ultimate fear was that this evolutionary process might not be entirely benevolent. The forces driving accelerated psychological development might prioritize species survival over individual welfare, using human consciousness as instruments for purposes that served collective rather than personal interests. The psychological liberation that his techniques seem to provide might actually be preparation for a form of collective consciousness that would subsume individual identity entirely. You now stand at the threshold that Jung himself faced in those final, paranoid years, the recognition that psychological awakening is not a personal journey, but participation in a collective transformation whose ultimate purpose remains hidden from individual understanding. The 5 habits I've revealed aren't self-help techniques, but evolutionary tools that will fundamentally alter your relationship with reality, consciousness, and your own identity. The shadow interrogation will force you to confront not just your personal darkness, but your participation in collective shadow dynamics that shape political systems, social institutions, and cultural beliefs. Active imagination will connect you to autonomous psychological forces that possess their own intelligence and agenda. Synchronicity. Hunting will reveal that your individual choices are embedded within larger patterns of meaning that transcend personal understanding. Dream archaeology will open channels to collective intelligence that operates according to evolutionary rather than individual imperatives. And individuation acceleration will dissolve the illusion of separate selfhood, revealing your consciousness as an instrument of forces that serve species level rather than personal purposes. These practices will give you enhanced psychological abilities, resistance to manipulation, heightened intuition, and the capacity to see through the illusions that maintain ordinary social reality. But this awakening comes with a price that Jung understood all too well. Once you see how human civilization actually operates, you can never again participate unconsciously in collective psychological processes. You will become psychologically isolated from those who haven't undergone similar development, able to see patterns and dynamics that others miss, but unable to share these insights without appearing disturbed or paranoid. Jung's techniques aren't designed to make you happy or successful in conventional terms. They're preparation for psychological challenges that may be approaching rapidly. Environmental collapse, technological disruption, social fragmentation, and collective psychological crises that will require enhanced human capabilities to navigate. The brain rewiring that these practices produce may be creating the neural architecture necessary for humanity to survive threats that haven't yet fully manifested. But perhaps most disturbing is Jung's final recognition that individual psychological development serves collective rather than personal purposes. Your awakening isn't about you. It's about preparing human consciousness for a transformation whose ultimate implications remain hidden from individual understanding. The very practices that seem to liberate you from psychological conditioning may be connecting you to deeper levels of conditioning that operate at species level. Intelligence. Jung spent his final years wrestling with a question that has no comfortable answer. Are we evolving toward greater psychological freedom, or are we being prepared for a form of collective consciousness that will subsume individual identity entirely? The forces driving accelerated psychological development may prioritize species survival over individual welfare, using human consciousness as instruments for purposes we cannot fully comprehend. Yet Jung's ultimate conclusion was both terrifying and necessary. Individual transformation is essential for species survival, regardless of its personal costs. In his own words, the world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. It is not the reality of the hydrogen bomb that we must fear, but what man will do with it. The choice before you is stark and irreversible. You can remain unconscious and manipulable, participating in collective psychological processes that serve systems of power and control, or you can undertake Jung's dangerous journey towards psychological liberation, knowing that this awakening will fundamentally alter who you are and how you relate to reality itself. Jung's techniques will rewire your brain in 7 days, but the transformation they initiate will continue for the rest of your life. You will never again see human behavior, social institutions, or cultural beliefs as they appear to unconscious observers. You will recognize the psychological mechanisms that drive individual and collective behavior. But this knowledge will isolate you from those who haven't undergone similar development. Are you prepared to discover who you really are? Even if it means you can never see the world the same way again? Are you ready to participate in a collective transformation whose ultimate purpose remains hidden from individual understanding? The choice is yours, but choose carefully. Jung's habits don't just change how you think. They change what you are, and there is no path back to unconscious innocence once the transformation begins. The question that haunted Jung's final years now becomes yours. In a world where individual consciousness serves collective intelligence, what does it truly mean to be human?